journey beyond imposter syndrome. This is where I invite you into a space where high achievers and spiritual leaders converge to redefine success and self-worth. By sharing transformative stories and engaging with thought leaders, this podcast serves as a roadmap for navigating the complexities of imposter syndrome. It's an intimate look into overcoming personal barriers tailored for those who value wisdom, leadership, and intuition in business and life. Join me at the Humble Warrior Podcast with Alani Bankhead. Welcome to the Humble Warrior Podcast, my fellow Humble Warriors. You guys, today is such a special day because I've got Mr. Mark Kluke here with me. There are very few people on this planet who get me all emotional, but Mr. Kluke is one of them. He is probably the best boss I've ever had. And I'm really honored to share some of his story with you guys. So 40 years of law enforcement experience, Japan, Quantico, Chief of the Joint Staff Support Branch at the Joint Counterintelligence Center. Y'all, he was at the Pentagon on 9/11. Then he went to be the agent in charge of the office in Bahrain. He did a bunch of counterterrorism stuff. He even has some professional acting chops. He did a cameo on NCIS Los Angeles. So he's done all of the things. I am so humbled to get to know him from our days working at the International Justice Mission, which is an anti-slavery nonprofit. He was the director of investigations and law enforcement development, and I was his Latin America person for a while. And so thank you so much, sir. He's also the co-founder of Prevention Now. It's a nonprofit that uses collaboration AI, data, and preventative interventions to end human trafficking. So even in retirement, this man just keeps going. And I'm really honored to share his story today because I've learned so much from him, and I'm really excited for you guys to learn from him as well. So thank you so much, sir, for being here with me today.
Lonnie, that was a most gracious introduction. Thank you very much. I'm not sure that I deserve any or all of that, but it's very kind of you. And I was blessed to have a wonderful career and to be able to work along great professionals such as yourself. I count that a true huge blessing for me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, sir. Yes. So we're going to dig into all of this. So anybody who's listening, who's heard the podcast before, knows that it's all about overcoming self-doubt and that fear of not being good enough. And so I love bringing incredible guests like you on who have had quote unquote successful careers, right? So on the outside, on paper, everybody's very impressed with what you do, but oftentimes we don't hear about that messy middle process on what had to happen for you to get there. And so I'm curious, in your own words, how would you describe your career and what internal barriers did you have to overcome?
I actually give a speech occasionally called Roadblocks and Disappointments and Detours, because I feel like in many ways my life, my career has been that. And I don't want to spend too much time on the history of growing up and so forth, but I had aspirations as a young man in high school and college, and they didn't quite work out the way I had hoped. I had pursued one particular young lady as a love interest for years with no luck until the good Lord stepped in. And now we've been married for coming up on 46 years. It's been the love of my life and second only to my Christian faith. But yeah, I think to characterize my life, it's been a lot of surprises for me because I had never intended for my life and my career to end up the way it did, which was incredibly positive. And I never would have dreamed that I was capable of success in the missions that I was given.
That is so fascinating. And we are going to talk about Miss Mona a little bit down the road. Miss Mona is amazing. And so I love that you use the word surprise to characterize, it sounds like a lot of your career, because to be honest, having known you for as long as I have at this point, and obviously knowing your history and having heard you on other podcasts, you've had such an impressive career. And a lot of people at IJM, they'd always be like, ooh, it's Mr. Kluke, right? Everybody else was on a first name basis, but not Mr. Kluke. But the concept of being surprised, when you were younger or at the beginning of your career, what did you imagine success looked like back then?
Sure. I'll actually go back a little bit further if you don't mind, Alani. I came from a Coast Guard family. My father was a Coast Guard career officer. My eldest brother was a Coast Guard master chief. And my middle brother was in the Navy as a pilot during Vietnam. So I had these aspirations of going into the military, specifically the Coast Guard. I actually, first 3 years of my life where I lived on a Coast Guard station. And my great dream was to attend the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Unfortunately, my grades just weren't sufficient. And I don't know that I was all that surprised by that, but I was certainly disappointed. I thought it was a stretch because I was more interested in sports during high school and didn't really apply myself academically as much as I should have, obviously. But so that was a big disappointment for me. And all of a sudden I had to change my aspirations dramatically. My middle brother got out of the Navy at the end of Vietnam and joined ultimately an organization called the Naval Investigative Service because my eldest brother, at that point in his Coast Guard career, had become a special agent with Coast Guard intelligence. So I thought maybe law enforcement is the ticket for me. So I applied to my beloved, then what was NIS, the Naval Investigative Service, soon to become the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I guess it was in 1980. No, I'm sorry, back up. 1979, 1980, yeah, somewhere in that time frame, and was turned down. Second big disappointment, I go to work for the Annapolis City Police Force after graduating from the Baltimore City Police Academy and spent 2 years doing that. I tried to work on some foreign language skills to make myself more attractive to NCIS. And then in March of 1982, I finally won a position as a brand new probie NCIS special agent. And I was absolutely thrilled with that. I felt like here I am, I've made it, I've accomplished at least this goal. And I can remember in our basic training, one of the first questions asked by the instructors is anybody that wants to be, imagines themselves becoming the director one day of NCIS, raise your hand. And I thought, there's no way. That is a dream. No, never. I reported to my first office in Newport, Rhode Island as this young, wet behind the ears, newly trained special agent and thought if I could just retire as a senior special agent, and that'd be great because senior special agents were looked up to, GS-13 level type personnel. And I thought that's where I'm headed. That's my career goal. At the end of at least 20 years, I want to be a GS-13 and a senior agent. And the rest, it just life evolved and my career evolved. And thank God in a pretty positive direction.
Incredible. Oh my gosh. I'm learning all kinds of new things about you, by the way. And my jaw was on the floor when you mentioned not having applied yourself in high school, because that does not jive with the person I know. Like the idea that you were more into sports than academics is super wild. So for those of you who maybe you didn't apply yourself in high school or college, there's hope for you. You could be the next
Yeah,
NCIS director.
absolutely. And I just want to reinforce that, Alani. I was a B average kind of student in high school getting by. My GPA for college was not all that impressive. Again, and in college, it was a little different. I realized, okay, I failed myself in high school by not applying myself, having a little more fun with sports and dating towards the later years in high school than I probably should have. But then when I got to college, I started to mature and realize I need to apply myself more. But it wasn't because I was distracted by personal interests so much as I needed to pay my way through college. And I was raised in a loving home, but my parents basically raised me like one day you've got to stand on your own 2 feet. So if you want to go to college, we'll encourage you, we'll help you, but you're ultimately going to earn your way through college. So at times I was working as many as 3 part-time jobs and commuting to and fro. I'll blame that on my rather mediocre GPA in college. But
Oh my.
to that point, and to your point specifically, if you just continue to apply yourself and strive for those goals that you feel like you could attain, you can get to places you've never imagined. And thank the good Lord, I found some of those places.
Oh my goodness, 100%. This resonates so much. So it's funny because when I was applying for OSI, I also didn't have the greatest GPA in college because I was having a good time. And
Mhm.
looking back now, I always joke that I'm like, I got my real start in human intelligence serving tables, assessing the people at the tables as I was walking up. And that
Mhm.
was my real education.
And very valuable at that.
So valuable. And when OSI would send me to do recruiting events at colleges, I would always have one person at the end who would pull me to the side and in secret say, I have a terrible GPA, but I really want to do what you do. And I was like, honey, let me tell you my GPA. and, and here I am as living proof that you too can chase your dreams. But I think the point is that constant beating of ourselves up for not arriving to the level of perfection that we think is expected of us. And the point of the podcast is to share stories of people who are successful on the outside and share that messy middle, right? The fact that Mr. Mark Kluke had this pass is just heartwarming for me. And so, okay, now I think you mentioned you applied for NIS in the 70s and then you didn't get in until about 82. So it was a few years in there of working. And so, out of curiosity, internally, what was happening for you? Was there a lot of like doubt, like if NCIS or NIS would pick you up? Like, what did that mental process look like for you to get to that and to the end of that race?
Mhm. Yeah, it did. I had my questions. At that point in history, NCIS or NIS was hiring people. You had to have a minimum of a bachelor's degree and preferably with a decent GPA and also language skills or some other advanced degree, Juris Doctorate or something along those lines. So I thought, man, my chances have really had my balloon burst here. I thought I was a shoe-in, especially with two brothers. I was hoping that there was some legacy help here, but not really. And it was disappointing for sure. It was heart-wrenching. I asked for guidance, and NCIS said, you need to go back and get some kind of real life experience. Go be a police officer for 2 years. So I took that guidance and I went directly to apply for, I think, 4 or 5 local law enforcement agencies. And the first one that called to offer me a job was in Annapolis City. So at that point, I realized this is where I'm at. So I'm going to make the best of what I've got. I have to apply myself and do the very best I can. Annapolis was a small police department, so they didn't have their own academy. They would send us off to the Baltimore City Police Academy. And while serving there, I thought, again, I'm going to apply myself the best I can and just hope for the best. My Christian faith at that point was starting to mature, and I began to lean a little heavier on prayer. I was also married to Mona at that point, and she encouraged the same and was a prayer partner with me. That I think at that point, we also matured to the point of whatever your will is, God, that's good. Not necessarily what my dreams are. Let's just go with what your will is, and we'll do the best we can. So I spent 2 years as a patrol officer in Annapolis and thought I'm going to reapply to NIS and just see. And fortunately, the words of the individual who gave me my initial screening interview was, "All right, we'll take a chance on you." Yeah. Okay. See, I guess I can back into the door then with my head hung low. Uh, and then once again, you just, wherever you find yourself in life, make the very best you can of where you're at that moment and have goals, certainly, but don't be crushed when what you thought for sure was the way ahead, the path ahead, doesn't pan out because God's got a bigger, better plan for you. We can't compete with God when it
Ooh,
comes to his plan and his timing.
that
It's
is
always,
so good. We
always
can't compete.
no way. Don't
I
even
love that.
have a plan, but when it doesn't come through, just look for where God's trying to aim you.
Yes.
My whole life has been that, honestly. Even at the point of my retirement from NCIS, I can't remember, Alani, did I ever share with you how I found IJM or IJM found me?
Mm.
Okay, so when we're at that point in the podcast, you let me know and remind me, and we'll talk about that.
I will. Okay, I love that. So there's a lot of really great tools that you just mentioned that I just want to highlight for the listeners. So first is there's going to be a gap in waiting, especially if you're early in your career or if you're in a career transition. There's going to be so much uncertainty, right? And there's a couple of things that you utilize there to get you through. So, first was I like to call it do what you have to do until you do what you want to do. So you wanted to be an agent for whatever reason, it wasn't working out on the timeline you wanted. And so you took their counsel, you did a couple years on patrol to get that real world experience. But then there was also this tool of surrender that was utilized. So I could hear in your voice as you were talking about the before. If I had these dreams and I wanted to follow in my family's footsteps, there's like a control element there to
Mhm.
where as soon as you implemented the tool of prayer and you had this prayer partner in Miss Mona, that the surrender happened and you said, you know what? I have my dreams, but you have a will, God, and whatever you want to do, I'm game for. But that doesn't mean you stop working towards like what you think the dream should be.
That's right. Absolutely correct.
I love that so much. And so, in terms of the spiritual element, because it was such a natural transition, it sounds like I know in two sentences we covered probably years of personal development and growth. How did your spiritual practice develop? And you talked about an immature season and then leading into this mature season. What were the catalysts that led you to wake up and say, oh, I actually really need to work on this part of my life?
Yeah, I think there was just this natural maturing process, but I also had some good Christian mentors, not the least of which were my two brothers, both older than me, and somewhat significantly, one 11 years and the other almost 15 years older than I. So I grew up with like three fathers in a way. I always seemed to have a father looming close by. My dad was a great Christian influence on me as well as my mother. But as I matured and became more of my own man, my brothers then took on that role of shepherding and helping me. And I realized not everybody has that sibling connection, but there are friends out there who will help you, fellow church members, whoever. But for me, the greatest help in my Christian maturity was being equally yoked with my lovely bride. And both of us, and I can feel confident I can speak for her, no problem. Everybody who walks the Christian walk will have times where they fade away a little bit. They're more self-reliant and not as faithful in their prayer life and so forth as they may should be. But we have a tendency, we're a yin and yang, we pull each other back. If I'm backing off, she pulls me back in and vice versa. And I would say that our dependency on prayer has only become more intense as we've grown in our faith, as we see more and more direct results of committed prayer.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love that so much. So I love that you mentioned the self-reliance, right? So especially with humble warriors, I find that the typical life process that they go through is they're people of excellence. They want to do the best possible in an unhealthy place that can switch to perfectionism, which is not what we want, right? Because that's when guilt and shame gets introduced because you're not good enough, all that stuff. So the fact that someone like you is talking about sometimes I would stray from the things I profess to believe in, and sometimes I would try to rely too much on myself. And thankfully, I had a community there to pull me back and hold me accountable. And I think especially post-pandemic, it's no secret that we're feeling lonelier than ever, right? The Surgeon General came out, said there's a loneliness epidemic, and cultivating that community. Thankfully, it was built into your nuclear family when you were younger, but also it takes work for us to find those right people and mentors and communities that we feel like we belong. And so I love that you did mention sometimes I'm the same way. I'll stray from my faith. And even though I'm like literally my only job every day is to connect with the source. And then when I don't do that, I could beat myself up. But I have to do the work to say it's okay. I can connect with God at any time and God's still with me, even if I don't connect with him, right? But I love that so much. And okay, you and Miss Mona are together. You've started your career. So what did the beginning years of Agent Clookie look like for you?
We moved to Newport, Rhode Island. That was my first posting. And we had not been married. We'd been married about 2 years at that point. So it's the first time that either of us had lived a significant distance from our families. Made our marriage all the stronger. Absolutely. Now we had to depend on each other. And that was a great thing, and it has served us well throughout many transfers and many challenges. We began to have our family there in Newport, ultimately three children born there in Newport, Rhode Island, in a span of 5 short years, actually. But it was a good growing experience for me as an agent. We also had to find a church of fellow believers that we could find communion with and enjoy that fellowship. And that was the first of many church transitions, if you will. Obviously, every time we transferred, and I think we transferred 11 times in my 30 years with NCIS, which is fine. That's all good. But it just goes to show you that pretty much anywhere God puts you, you can find people of faith that you can commune with, fellowship with, lean on, and support, to include mentors. And you should. I think everybody should always have a mentor, at least one. Even at my age now of 67, I have mentors that continue to lead me down life's path. Um,
Oh, I love that. Okay, I'm really glad that you mentioned that because mentors are obviously a very important resource. But to be honest, I think a lot of times people struggle to find mentors. I know I did. And when I was earlier in my career, I knew I needed mentors, and it would take a lot of courage for me to go to somebody and say, "Will you be my mentor?" And sometimes I'd get this awkward, "Okay," and people were very gracious, and I would have single serving mentorship, is what I call it. And even I was mentioning before we started recording, for the listener, it's still a lot of work for me to ask for help and for mentorship. That's one of the things that I have been working on for some years now, and the idea of, I actually was whining to God. I was telling Mr. Clookie about this before the call, that I was like, God, what am I going to do with this podcast? I don't have people I could talk to. And God's, what is in your hand, Alani? So we're invoking a little Moses, and Moses had a staff in his hand. And immediately I thought about you and some other people, and I was like, oh, I do have an amazing network that I never ask for help because there's still some shame there about taking time away from someone as busy and impressive as you. And for those people who are also struggling to find mentors, what would you suggest in terms of what worked for you to find these mentors and cultivate those relationships?
right. Thank you. Yeah, mentorship is important. And I would suggest what I learned to do over the years was to go to people that I trust, but not necessarily knowing that or imagining that they would be my mentor, but maybe that they could guide me to a mentor. You also need to be vulnerable. And you touched on this, Alani. You need to be vulnerable enough to say, I'm at this spot in my life. I can't quite work my way through it. I need somebody who has either lived this or has the wisdom that can help me do that. And to be able to verbalize that to somebody takes some cojones. You have to be able to muster up the inner courage to say, I need help. And this specifically is where I need that help. Once you can do that, and that's why I say go to somebody you trust, even if they're not the person you would imagine that would be ultimately your mentor. Now, they could be, but I'll give you a prime example. When I was about to retire as the director of NCIS, I thought, well, what am I going to do now? For 30 years, I've been an NCIS agent, and once an NCIS agent, always an NCIS, or with O&I. So now what do I do? And more importantly, I wanted to live out my Christian life and gifts so that I could continue to serve the kingdom somehow with but what do you do with, I'm thinking in my mind, uh, no church is going to employ me as a pastor. No church is going to employ me as an executive pastor, or I, none of them are big enough to warrant a security director or whatever. I just couldn't imagine. But nevertheless, there was a man I trusted, and he was the chief of Navy chaplains. And I went to him and I said, here's where I am in my life. I'm about to retire and I need some guidance on how do I look for that next job and know that I'm still pursuing God's will for my life. And he then referred me to another gentleman, that a civilian, former Marine officer, now retired, a great man of faith. And I spoke with him. And ultimately, this begins that path of how I found IJM, and ultimately now where I am with prevention now. And it's one of those stories that just puts the hair up on the back of your neck. So, yeah, just trust somebody, find somebody you trust, ask them for help, and they can often lead you to that person that should be your mentor.
Oh man, I appreciate that commentary so much. And I'm like, where was this conversation 25 years ago, right? I could have overcome so much of my internal nonsense if someone like you to come out and say, you have to be vulnerable, and it's an act of courage to be vulnerable, but you have to do it in the right context and environment, meaning you have to do it with people you trust because you can't give that vulnerability to just anybody. Now, I'm curious, you're in the middle of this, you're at the end of a very successful government career, and you're back in this discomfort of what do I do next? You are
Mhm.
vulnerable, you use that vehicle to get to this answer. What did it feel like when you discovered IJM and you had that kind of aha, oh, this is probably my next step? What did that look like for you?
All right, so here's where I'm going to tell you this story. Um, so I'm at the end of my NCIS career. For those listeners who may not realize this, civilian special agents of the federal government age out. There's a shelf life. And I'm quickly approaching the age of 57, which is you got to go. You can no longer serve the US government or the US people as a special agent. So as I'm approaching those years, I begin to think about retirement. And part of that was, of course, prayer, daily prayer with my prayer partner, Mona, and looking for what's next. And pardon me if this goes on a little bit, but I think the story really tells itself. I talked with my mentor, and he suggested several books to read, one of which was written by Max Lucado called A Cure for the Common Life. And it's all about transitioning into a position that God can still make use of you because of your gifts and talents that God has given you. And basically, how do you serve out God's plan for the rest of your life? That book went into a pile of 4 or 5 books on my nightstand because I was a scatterbrained reader. I'd pick up this book and read it a couple chapters, and then that book, and so forth. So imagine 5 books piled on my nightstand. I go to my secretary at the time and ask her I mentioned to her, I said, we've got one more class of special agents that are about to graduate from basic training before I retire. And rather than sending my deputy director or anybody else in the executive chain, I think I want to go down and just oversee that graduation. So she said, oh, that's a great idea. I'll set everything up for you. And she did. She chose one of 3 airports that I could fly out of. She chose one of 2 airports that I could fly into. She chose the airline, the time. So you see all the variables that are built into this. So she said, I'll take care of all that, Mr. Clookie. We've got you. We'll get you down there to Glencoe for the graduation. Great. And I leave everything in her hands. Meantime, night before the flight, I chose the Max Lucado book to take, one of 5 to take on my trip for my reading. I get on the plane the next morning, and as you might imagine, there's not a lot of alone time in my position. There's always somebody on my heels, asking questions, looking for answers, whatever. So getting on a plane was really a great time for me to relax and just enjoy. So an hour and a half flight to Jacksonville, Florida, or whatever it is. I begin reading this book by Max Lucado, and I've got my earphones or my ear pods in. I've got my glasses on, and my head is basically buried in this book, even as people are lining onto the aircraft. And there's an empty seat next to me. I think, oh, good, I've got an empty seat next to me. This is going to be great. At the very last minute, the last person to board the plane sits in that seat. And she's a talker. And she proceeds to talk. Her name is Dale, and she's a friend. But initially, I was quite annoyed to the point that as she continued to talk and my wife tells me I'm so transparent, I take out my earphones and I drop them in my book. I take off my glasses, I fold them up, put them in the case, close the book, and look at her like, all right, I guess we're going to talk. And she immediately apologized. She said, I'm so we get to talk. Through the conversation, she asked, what do you do? I didn't want to get into great specifics, but I said, I work for a federal agency and this is what we do. And I'm thinking about retirement and so forth and so on. And she said, oh, she said, I know the author of your book. And I said, really? With that skepticism that you and I can appreciate, right? And she says, yeah, Max Lucado. He's a friend of mine. And I said, oh, he's actually a friend of yours, is he? And she says, yes. And I know what the book is all about because I've written a similar book for ladies about how they can transition and use God's gifts for their future. And I said, okay, now you got my interest. Long story short, all this continues, this conversation continues. And she says to me, she says, before we get off the plane or before we leave each other's company, I want you to meet my husband and my son. And I said, are they going to be in the terminal or at the rental car center? Where are they going to be? And she says, no, they're right back here, several rows back. And I said, why aren't you seated with your husband and son? She says, oh, I had no intention of making this trip. It was just a last minute thing. The only seat left was this seat. That's why I'm here to bother you, basically. And I said, whatever. I said, it's all good. So sure enough, I meet the husband and son and we part ways. And I think that's the last I will see of Dale. Not a good, we became friends right there on the plane, actually. I don't think anything more of it. And about, I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks later, the same secretary that set all this up comes into my office and she says, Director, I have to beg a favor of you. And I said, absolutely. She's a wonderful lady. And I said, what do you need? And she says, I need you to take this call. And I said, who is it? She says, it's just this guy and he keeps calling. He's been calling and I've been trying to shield you from, but he will not speak to anybody else in the organization. I've tried to give him to the deputy. I've tried to give him to the other executives, and he insists that he will only speak with you. And I said, okay, put him through it. And this fellow, I get on the phone and he says, you don't know me, but I work for the International Justice Mission. He said, have you ever heard of that? And I said, I've heard of it, but I don't really know it. And he said, we're a Christian organization, nonprofit that rescues slaves. I said, okay, so what's the point? And he said, do you remember sitting on a plane a couple of weeks ago next to a lady named Dale? And I said, I do. And he said, for 2 years, we've been looking for somebody to take this position as the director of our investigations and law enforcement development, our vice president for that. And I said, what's this got to do with Dale? And he says, she's on our board of directors and she brought your name to our attention and we think you're the right fit.
Oh,
You can imagine at that point, the hair on the back of my head, after 2 years of searching for what's next, this is me searching for what's next, with headhunters looking for me, with friends and relatives looking for opportunities, nothing pans out, which goes to prove that it's not about me and my plans. It's what God's got planned. And I think this was God saying, see, when you thought all hope was lost, I had it all along. I had it worked out. All you had to do was trust. Imagine all the variables of which plane I would be on that day, out of which airport, flying to which airport, all the different flight arrangements that could have been made, all the different seat assignments. And Dale Hansen Bork decides at the last moment to fly. And she happens to know the author of the one book that I picked up off of my nightstand the night before. And she also happens to be a board of director member or director of the board for International Justice Mission. It was
insane.
like, oh, bam, there. God just hit me right between the eyes with a 2x4 and said, I'm trying to show you that I know what's going on here.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. I got chills hearing you say that. And
It
it is
feels,
a lightning bolt moment. And
yeah.
not every decision is like that, but I love it when God is that gracious that he's here you go. And through my own experiences similar to that, it's funny because I'm like, oh, God really does have all of our emotions. He's sarcastic too. You know?
I think
Of
so. Yeah.
yeah,
Sometimes
yeah,
he's got a
you
sense
know,
of humor.
a total sense of humor, and I love it. And so, thank you so much for sharing that because I love to. It highlights another point that I see a lot with the people that I work with, which is life is cyclical, right? So just because you had these periods of lack of clarity or direction and then figure it out. You got into NIS, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have those moving forward at different transition periods of your life. Even someone who, objectively speaking, is as successful as you are at the end of your NIS career, you were unsure and God still had a plan for you. And I know for me, I don't know if it's like this for you, but it's a constant growth of God just always pushing me to deepen my faith and show me opportunities to trust him. And when I look back on when I was younger and my faith was much weaker, it's just night and day. And even though the stretching is uncomfortable, I'm super thankful for it. So I love that you shared that. Now, one thing that has been a theme weaving through this conversation and in all of the time that I've known you is for the listeners who don't know you, you are such a loving person and you don't say it, but it's just in your intention and everything that you do and in who you are as a person. Even the idea of your government service, like there's this theme of love, and I don't know if it's love of country or love of service to others, but when we talk about who Mark Kluke is, who God made you to be, if you had to distill that down to one line or maybe two, what would that be?
I think a service leader. I feel an absolute burden to serve. And you'll appreciate that. I know you're still very active with ONI, and I thank you for that. I am very much encouraged by talented young people such as yourself continuing to serve our country. It gives me great hope. As I retired from NCIS, it was just too much to give up. I had to find a place of meaningful service. IJM fit that bill quite well. And then after about 5 years, I felt the Lord saying, it's time to move on to something new. So myself and a fellow IJMer, Kristen Harris, now Kristen Hubble, founded Prevention Now. And we can get into that later, but I still wasn't completely satisfied. And I'm now serving as the assistant chief of the Deep Creek Volunteer Fire Company in Deep Creek, Maryland, and an EMT for the county, emergency medical technician. And people are saying, like, you were the director of NCIS and you're a firefighter and an EMT, where you deal with some of the ugliest, most heartbreaking things you can imagine. Yeah, that's where I want to be. I think that's where God created me to be. I'm a servant. But I also think you couldn't have convinced me of this years ago, but now I think God's beat into my head that I have leadership skills. So that's a combination of where I see God wants me to be as a servant leader. And I've never been more fulfilled.
Mm.
Perfectly happy responding to fire calls in the middle of the night and picking people up and helping them in the ambulance or whatever's required. That's where God wants me, and I'm happy to be here.
I love that. If only people knew that they were being picked up by the former director of NCIS on an EMT call. And it's funny because I remember you and Miss Mona, when you would go on vacation, you would be doing your volunteer firefighter and EMT stuff. And back at IJM, we'd all be like, Mr. Clookie's such a badass. Like even on his vacation, he's doing all this over. Oh my gosh. It's just, I love that. The concept of it doesn't matter where I am, I'm going to be of service because that's who
Yeah.
I am. And it's a journey to get there. And I really appreciate that you use the term burden, right? It's a burden of service because that's something that comes up a lot when it comes to people with imposter syndrome. So the concept that they're not good enough or qualified for the work that they're called to do. I find that it's very paradoxical in that when you figure out what your life purpose is, it's so big that your brain has this mechanism it creates where it says, don't even try because if you try and you fail, like you're going to be a failure at your life purpose. But the joy part for me is I always tell the people I work with, I'm like, for good or bad, your soul is not going to let you off the hook. Like, you're going to do
Exactly.
it, whether you're willingly going into this or not. And it is hard. And I'll confess, I left my last W-2 job almost 3 years ago, and I was burned out on the leadership stuff too. And I just remembered being like, I'm done with people. I'm done leading them. I just need to work for myself. I'm tired. And a lot of that was of my own making because I didn't have good enough boundaries and I wasn't resting, to be honest. And there was a moment some years later where God was like, I created you to be a leader. And the burden of leadership, it is heavy, but you're built for it. And it was just so humbling. And God's correction for me has never been guilt-ridden. It's always very loving and very, hey, I'm just here to let you know this is what you're here to do. And when you're ready to come back. And God has been really funny and faithful to just the gentleness of that journey. I'm so thankful for. And so for you, God told you it was time to move on. And that can be a hard thing too, right? Of you're built to be a leader. This mission is incredible. And our team was incredible. Literally, like at IJM, it was the most amazing team of people. And so what led you to prevention now? How did that come about?
Yeah, at that point in my life, I learned that I have to just be in constant prayer about God, what's next? And that's day to day. I literally every night pray, God, just guide my path. Every step I take, show me where I need to be. And that's why I think I got that feeling like, okay, it's time to move on from IJM. Great people, great mission. And I pray that God continues to bless them richly and protect them because they do some crazy, dangerous stuff. But I thought there was something more. I just had this feeling like there's got to be something more. And this is what started the conversations between Kristen and I about, and you can appreciate this more than most. We collectively, the MCIOs, military criminal investigative organizations, have done a fabulous job, thanks to folks like you, of protecting our warriors and their families from terror attacks. And it's because we've created a system of being able to figure out, okay, where are we vulnerable? Where are we most likely to get attacked? Who's going to do it? What's their modus operandi? And so forth. And I thought, well, if we can do this for terrorism, what else is heavy on my heart? My heart's heavy for people, the most vulnerable people in our society being exploited. And how do we stop that? How can we stop that? So what Kristen and I hatched was this idea of leveraging artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the collection of intelligence or data or information to determine who is most vulnerable, who's most likely in this particular community, whatever it is, whether it's a heavy urban environment or a rural environment like I live here in Appalachia. But who in that environment, with all those intricacies of the geography and the culture and the demographics, is most likely to be victimized? Who's most likely to perpetrate that victimization? And how do we break it? How do we break that chain before it ever happens? And I know that you have done some phenomenal work in pursuing the rescue of exploited children and also seeing their exploiters come to justice. And thank you for that. Please continue. But that work has to happen. We have to continue to rescue those who are victimized. But I also had this epiphany of every time we rescue somebody, that's great. But if we don't break the system, take the exploiter to justice or whatever, all we've created is a vacuum, really, where now a previously untouched, untarnished human being is going to get sucked into that environment and they're going to be victimized. So that's why I thought we got a little too much of balance one way. We have to continue to rescue, but we also have to look at prevention. And that's where we created prevention now.
I love that.
Your prayers for continued success for prevention now, please.
Absolutely, you have it. And I love that, especially too, because there's so often in the anti-trafficking space, I admittedly get a little bit frustrated because you have all these people screaming about recoveries and rescuing the victims and all this stuff. But when you talk about prevention, people are a lot less likely to address the core issues that lead to trafficking, right? And So I'm constantly, when I'm doing community outreach for that topic, talking about, hey, you got to clean up your own house and hold people accountable to certain behaviors that aren't appropriate. Or if I'm doing a presentation from a law enforcement perspective, and one of the things I like to tell people is we talked about spidey sense, right? I'm
Mhm.
like, if your spidey sense is going on, I want you to tell me. I would rather you tell me, we look into it and it be nothing, than you have spidey sense and ignore it and then someone continues to be victimized. And that's a vulnerable thing too, right? But for those who maybe aren't Christians or are still on their journey of discovering what their spiritual practice looks like, I sometimes will call it the metaphysical, right? I'm like, it's something you know is true that you have no evidence to prove that it exists, right? When my spidey sense goes off, I know that my body's trying to tell me something. And you have a responsibility, I think, to honor that and act on it. And whether you call it God or we're not judging people here for what they believe in, but that's the kind of stuff is the point of the podcast is to cultivate that spirituality and understand how does God talk to you? What does God want you to do? And so I love that prevention now is so prevention focused because of course, on the flip side, we justice seekers, we like to see results, right? Like it feels good to know that you did a certain thing, but with prevention, you have to trust that you made waves in the ether that you're never going to see the physical evidence of here on earth. And that requires a really deep spiritual practice and knowing. And the only way you're going to get there if you're a listener that says, there is something I want to create, right? I have a vision for something. You have to connect with that source to understand how you were made, where you're supposed to go next, how to trust as you're creating the solution that has never been imagined before. So, thank you so much, sir, for that example. And so, I guess we'll close out because unfortunately, I'm running out of time with you. But what is the ultimate message you would like to leave with the listener today, whether they're starting their journey career-wise and they're worried they're not going to be successful, or if they're transitioning later on in their journey? What is the key thing you want them to remember?
I think it's natural for every one of us to not think we're capable of certain things, but we're not created by accident. Not a one of us. Each one of us was specifically created for a purpose, and that is to serve our Creator. And however you do that, whether you think that's great or small, it is what we're all about. People say the meaning of life is so mysterious and you can't wrap your no, meaning of life is very simple. You were created and you were created for a purpose, and that is to serve your Creator, which ultimately means you're going to serve your fellow human being and love them more than yourself. And when you do that with the gifts and talents that the Creator has just naturally woven into your very being, you will be the happiest, most joyful person you could ever imagine.
Oh, and that is a mic drop moment right there. And so I'll close it out by just saying also, there's something you said earlier in the podcast that I want to stick with listeners, which is why not you? Mr. Clookie was asked at the Academy, who here wants to be the director? And he was like, no way, right? This is the mark of a humble warrior is the people who, for whatever reason think that there's no way I could ever do that. But God's plan for your life is so much bigger than anything you could have imagined. And so it starts with that seed of why not you, right? You've heard stories like Mr. Clookie's where God has surprised them with the magnificence of their career paths and life paths. And I know that God loves you and has the same for you as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Kluke, for being here. We will make sure to link in the show notes the Prevention Now page so people can get to know a little bit more about your mission. And if you guys want to donate, please give to this worthy cause. I eyeballed your board of directors, some people I know on there, and they are also fabulous humans. So, you guys, if you're looking for a nonprofit to support, this is definitely one that is incredible and you're going to want to get behind. And Humble Warriors, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Mr. Kluke, for your time. I know it's really precious. And guys, until next time, remember that the world needs who you were made to be. Thank you for joining us today on this journey to discover how you can harness your imposter syndrome to work for you. See you next time. If you enjoyed this episode and would like some help overcoming your imposter syndrome, Check out the free life purpose exercise on my website and subscribe to my blog. If you already know what your life purpose is and are ready to crush or harness your imposter syndrome, then you're going to love my best-selling book, The Least of Us: How Your Weakness Points to Your Greatest Power, available on Amazon and all major book retailers. Or you can hit me up at alani@mightysparrowcoaching.com to discuss private coaching or corporate and government training. That's ALANI@mightysparrowcoaching.com. Listen, there's only ever been one you, and there will only ever be one you. And you have a specific gift to give that the world desperately needs. Don't let your self-doubt be the thing preventing you from living your most joyful and impactful life. Until next time, I'm always cheering you on.